How many different sound things do we have underneath there? Oh gosh. Too much.
Was it skimming? It was like...
Which makes sense. And most of the thing is I don't know what I'm gonna do. Let's try. Good idea. Oh, they took a picture of me too, please. With specific. Now, like, now for meetings like we're going to be doing. I feel but I just asked. I think honestly, I'm club management. I'm in my club.
All right, so we're gonna get started, everybody. It's 5:30. We got a lot of stuff to cover today, so I'm gonna try to keep my portion of it a little bit quick. Go to attendance.defsec.club and make sure you put your email address in there so that we can push out the apps to you next week. If you don't do that, you'll have to pull them down yourself, so make sure you do that. And if you have any questions throughout the meeting today, go to questions.defsec.club to ask them if you don't want to raise your hand. We can do it that way. So what is CCDC? So first thing we're going to cover today is the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. This is one of the bigger competitions that we do throughout the year. And we hold a few mock competitions throughout the year in order to train for it. One of those is going to be the next upcoming event for DefSec. So basically the main premise behind CCDC is you've been hired to do IT security by some random company. The old team was typically very bad at their job. They left a lot of security holes open. They managed their stuff very poorly. The environment is very badly secured, and your task is to secure the systems while performing IT tasks for your boss. So you might be asked to add new user accounts, maybe write up a security assessment report, say like, what are all the vulnerabilities across all of your system? Give me a write-up about that, rank them by like how easy it is to exploit this, how bad would it be if it was exploited, that sort of thing. And then also giving presentations to the CEO/CIO. So we'll ask like one member of your team to come into a room. Usually you'll be talking to some person not in like the usual DefSec sphere. So you might have a faculty member or some random outside person from a company that somebody here knows, and you'll be asked to basically give a presentation like, how are things going so far with securing the environment? What issues have you run into, and what are you doing to remediate those and things like that. We'll get more into it in a couple weeks, perhaps, when we talk about injects a little bit more. So basically the way that CCDC breaks down is we have three teams. We have blue team, which is you guys. You're the defenders of the network. We have the red team, which is the attackers. These are, they are sort of not part of the competition per se. They're sort of outside, and they're just providing a service to you. So the red team, usually we get some people from OffSec to play the attackers. They attack your systems. They're trying to get access to your stuff. They want to steal any sensitive data that you might have on your systems. So you might have like some social security numbers in like an Excel file sitting around on one of your file shares. You might have customer credit card information stored in a database somewhere, something like that. And they're trying to pull that stuff off your systems. And then finally, they want to destroy your stuff. So the main way that CCDC is scored is by service uptime plus your injects. So throughout the competition, you're trying to keep your services up and running. And red team, what they want to do is get on your stuff and then blow it up. So they want to destroy your services. They want to nuke your boxes, things like that. And then finally, we have white team, which is management. So the white team is sort of your referees. So that's going to be usually some upperclassmen. People who have done CCDC in the past will be doing this. We've had a few freshmen score injects in the past. So if you're interested in doing that, hit me up on Slack. I can try to get you plugged in. Basically what white team does is that we make the business requests, like we're your boss, we're asking you to do things throughout the process of the whole competition. We hold the meetings with the team captains, so the CEO is part of the white team, And then we service things like password change requests. We answer your questions if you have any questions about the competition as things go on. So if something is kind of weird and wonky and you don't understand why something's not working, you can come ask us, and we might be able to help you out and that sort of thing. So here's an example of a network. This was the first mock we did last year. So you'll have a network sort of like this. Typically, you're going to have 8 boxes to start with. Throughout the course of the year, we're going to bump that up over time, so you have more and more systems to take care of. You have more and more services that are more complicated to take care of. So this is just a little bit of an example of one of those. And basically your objectives throughout the competition is going to be to keep your services running. So you get points for every check that your service is up and running and it's working as it's supposed to. So we might be checking, say, like, can I log in over SSH using these credentials? Can I access your web page and does it look like I expect it to look? That sort of thing. And what you're trying to do throughout the competition is trying to avoid service level agreement violations. So what a service level agreement is that the company that you work for has made an agreement with its customers saying, I'm going to have X amount of uptime. So I'm going to have like 99% uptime. And if I'm down more than that, I think you can like sue them for basic like breach of contract or something like that. We'll give you restitution for the time I was down. So if your services are down for too long in a row, say like 6 checks in a row, you have your services down, you're going to lose points instead of just remaining flat. So it's something you really want to avoid is having your service down for a very long period of time. And when we send out the rules and everything for it, for CCDC, we'll have more like concrete objective measures in there. Other objectives, don't get hacked, obviously. This is a little bit limited for the first mock. So later on down the line, what we're going to do is introduce red team activity deductions. So if a red teamer gets on your box and they get root access, we're going to take points away from you. If they get access to some confidential information, we're going to take points away from you. If they get like user level access, we'll take points away from you, that sort of thing. That's going to be a little bit limited for the first few mocks. We're basically just going to be worried about confidential information. So social security numbers, credit card numbers, that sort of thing. And you get points back for incident response reports. So if, like, say someone steals some social security numbers off of a file share and you write up, here's how they got in, here's our IP address, here's when they did it, what did we do to remediate that? So like, did we encrypt the file? Did we change passwords? That sort of thing. And you can get a few points back from those incident response reports, but those are going to be sort of limited for the first few. Basically, the don't get hacked portion is just if red team gets on your box, at the end of the day, they're just going to blow it up. So you really want to avoid that. And then finally, servicing business requests, like I talked about earlier, you're going to have face-to-face meetings with the CEO. You're going to have to do some reports. You're going to have to service some system requests like adding user accounts, joining a box to like the domains, things like that, which we're going to talk about later today. There's a few different roles. Basically, we try to break things down into a few different roles. So you have your team captain who's going to be like in charge of your team. They're going to be coordinating everybody typically, and usually they're the person that's going to be giving the reports to the CEO. You have your inject handler. Usually we try to dedicate one, maybe up to like 3 people to handle injects and like work around that. So you're on top of the inject side of thing because injects are half of your points, the other half are service uptime. So you want to keep a handle on that. And then we have Windows admins, Linux admins. We try to specialize there. So you'll have different systems. Usually we try to keep it half Linux, half Windows for systems. You have your network firewall admin, which we usually try to dedicate to one person. Then an ESXi admin, which we're not going to get into probably till next semester. Question, is scripting allowed? We'll get to that in just a second. Services, here's an example of a bunch of services. For the first ones, we're probably just going to be working with all of these on the left except for IMAP and then HTTP. But as we go through the year, we're going to be adding more and more of these services onto there. So rules, basically for blue teamers, the rules are no attacking. You're not allowed to attack other people. You're not allowed to attack other blue teams. You're not allowed to attack the red team. You're not allowed to stage materials, which are scripts, pre-written reports, password lists, things like that. You can't bring things from outside the environment into the environment, basically. You can't have any phones, flash drives, or other outside devices which you might plug in. But for the first few, that's not going to be much of an issue because we're not going to have any sort of like physical machines for you to like plug stuff into. It's all going to be through the iLab, so that's not going to be an issue. Did you have something, Michael? I'm not sure. No? Okay. Yeah. So scripting is on scripting. So scripting is not allowed for blue teamers, but if you're on the red team, scripting is definitely allowed. Red team can do anything they want to, except for it's going to be within the bounds of what white team says or says you cannot do. So the way red team works, and you can probably talk to some people from OffSec like Kyle Corman about this, is that they're going to try to give you sort of a schedule, like at this point in time we're going to allow you to do these things, and then later on down the line we're going to allow you to do more stuff and more, and then towards the end of the competition you're allowed to like blow up boxes and things like that. Yes.
What can I bring into the competition?
What you can bring into the competition is you can bring in password lists. So you can say like, I want to write down a bunch of passwords for all my user accounts. You can bring those in on either like through Google Drive or on paper. You just can't import those into the environment. You have to actually type it out. You can bring checklists like we have in the training folder. Those you're allowed to bring. Obviously, you can't copy and paste scripts from the training folder into the actual environment, that sort of thing. So anything you can take in anything you want as long as it's not inside the environment. So you just have to type everything out yourself. You just can't like copy paste or download stuff off the internet that way, except for like tools that are already out there that are like free. Yeah.
Why are the rules like this?
Because that's the way the National Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition works. So we're trying to train you up for that, so we're going to use their rules even if they don't always make sense. So yeah, so the first mock competition is going to be October 19th in Beacom. That is a Saturday. It's in, I believe, two or 3 weeks. So all you need is your laptop. Everything's going to be through the AI lab and over Wi-Fi basically, so that's all you need. And you can sign up there at link.defsec.club/mock1019, and I'll post the link in Slack for you. All right, any last questions? All right, otherwise I'll hand it off to whoever's going first. I believe it's Michael.
Do I get questions laptop too?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, we should just start stealing. Let's just see here. Oh, that's weird. Whatever. Okay. Should we just start stealing the streaming PC to do this if we can? We'd have less issues. Oh, good to go. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to go over some Linux stuff. We're going to be kind of talking about services and init systems in general and how we manage services. Going to dive into package managers just a little bit, and then mess around with SSH and FTP and what's the general idea of what you need to do for those two services. So, getting into it right now. That's the VApp we're going to be using for this. We're going to be jumping around a fair bit. So it's DefSec, Linux, and Net, which let me just pull that up here and make sure that actually my copy is powered on. Now, I'll just be using that one anyway, whatever. So make sure to power it on. Got quite a few VMs in there, and we will be jumping around quite a bit. So that's the VM. I haven't already pulled it down. There's 2 checklists, which is actually a good reason for me to post this link to these slides in chat quick here. Actually, Nick, can you just post a link to the slides in chat? Oh yeah, that'd be hard, wouldn't it? Yeah. Because I stole your laptop. So I'll just post those quick here. Okay, that's a link to the slides. Sorry, we didn't have a nice bit.ly link for you this time. Okay, so there are 2 checklists. These are the ones we normally use for FTP which is one of the flavors of FTP servers you're going to have, and then one's an SSH checklist. Those links should be good, even if we do modify those checklists, as they are Google Docs. So those are pretty basic right now. We might, add a couple lines, add a page or two to those. Well, probably just a page to those checklists max. So let's talk about init systems. So init systems in general is all they're used for is the initialization part of Linux. They're used after when we start booting up a system. We have to determine how processes start. How does networking start? How does my SSH server start? How does my FTP server start? When and how do these things get started? When do they get stopped? That's something that's kind of dealt with the init system on a Linux system or a Unix system. They both use init systems. There's a couple different flavors. For the purposes of today's talk, we're going to be covering what I consider to be the main three. There is others. There is a lot, actually. But normally they kind of follow the same general concepts for our purposes. We don't care super deeply about trying to do a ton with these. We just really want to know how to start services, how to stop services, and then kind of locate files that Red Team could use for persistence. And then ideally, if you want to later, you can dive into these themselves and write configuration files for your own services and find ways to, configure your own stuff to use the init systems for management. So, first thing, we have sys5 init, as it's normally called, or sysv init, or whatever you call it. System. It's basically the oldest of the three. That is the one you're going to see on older Unix systems. That's the stuff you get on super old stuff. And there's probably some different ones even older, but that's the main one you get for the older Unix systems and older Linux systems. Most stuff you're going to have is going to be compatible with that in some way, shape, or form. You'll see that as we dive into stuff that if you write stuff for that particular init system, it will work with the other two main ones we work with. So, next one down we have Upstart, which is made by Ubuntu, or is made by Ubuntu. They thought that was going to be, the next big thing. Ubuntu really likes to do that. They like to be on the cutting edge of trying new things, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. In this case, they were wrong. Upstart never really got picked up. It really basically gave away to systemd, which is what's used now on most of your modern Linux and Unix systems, which is actually what Ubuntu uses now, not Upstart. So it has some nicer features. All these have a lot of features that we're probably not going to get into because we're really just concerned with the basics of how to use them, not the actual, nice things, nice reasons why we actually chose one over the other. We just really care about the basics. So why do we care about these? We like to start services. We like to stop them sometimes. We like to, have them run on boot so we don't have to start them manually because that'd be ridiculous. We like to disable them when they're red team persistence or they're just things you don't want to deal with, or sometimes we want to nuke them from orbit as well, which you can either mask them with systemd or, just delete the files. So that's kind of nice to know where stuff is to be able to actually delete them out of existence. Some concepts for the purposes of what we're doing, what init systems use. We have these things called run levels targets, or targets depending. So run levels is a sys5 init concept. I think Upstart kind of uses it as well. And targets are a systemd concept. Not going to dive into these super deeply. What you need to understand is these are a way of deciding in what order are our services starting. How do we manage dependencies? If we have SSH, we need to start the networking service before we start SSH. Otherwise, SSH isn't going to do anything because, we need an IP address for somebody to connect to our networking service. If we have a service that reaches out to the internet, we need to have networking started before that. So run levels and targets are a way to basically decide if we're starting this service, this one needs to be started first before we even do that. That's the idea, especially with targets where we kind of have a dependency chain of if we start this, then we need to start this first, and if we start our dependency, then we need to start its dependencies and so on down the list. Run levels is more of a concept of just like a raw order that we kind of have this associated number and you can shove whatever you want. But in general, we're just going to go down the list of we start 1 first, then we start 2, then we start 3, then we start 4, where targets are more of a dependency-oriented system. As always, if you guys have questions, want me to slow down, speed up, please send them at questions.defsec.club. But as you can see here on our chart, and some of them are a little bit weirder, like the power off target is a little bit weirder. For most stuff, we care kind of a little bit more about the multi-user, the networking sections of this. So for sys5 run levels, we're probably going to see stuff a lot more in 3 and 5. And actually, well, it's really just 2 through 5 in general. And then this is the important ones for systemd, like multi-user target, that's a big one. A lot of services will start with multi-user target. A lot will start with graphical. That's basically as much as we need to get out of it. These exist, they're a thing. Okay, so diving right into sys5 init, which for that purposes we're going to be using the SSH Server Box. Something to note, none of these are actually running sys5 init underneath because I didn't want to have to go dig up some stupidly old operating system. I probably should have, but I didn't. So we're just going to be looking at the artifacts that basically exist in almost any modern,
SendOS 6 uses sys5 init.
Yeah, I could have pulled that one off, but I didn't. So I didn't want to have to mess with that because I'd have another whole system just dedicated to the sys5 init we're going to be doing. The reason I don't need to do that is because the same files exist for the most part for backwards compatibility reasons. So it's kind of transparent to the service. How we actually manage those service, or how those service files get run and get started is not the same as it was. But as far as the same kind of locations and ways we can use it, that kind of exists transparently to the service. So we have some of the same artifacts, which is what I'm going to get into here in a second. We have, for the most part, the locations we care about with sys5 init, and there might be a couple I missed, but we have etc init.d. That's where we're going to have some configuration files. We have etc.rc.d, and then we have etc rc 0 through 6 is what it's going to be. So 0.d, 1.d, and so on. And then we're just going to get into how to basically start, stop, and restart those services. So, yay typos. So, log into this box. Username's going to be root. Password, as always, will be password1bang. So, and this is actually a pretty recent Debian box, but it still has the same artifacts. So if we cd to that directory, the etc init.d directory, we're going to see here. So in this directory, we have a lot of different files. That's the best way to they're files. And these basically define how do we start services, what happens when we start one, what happens when we stop one, and basically manages, it abstracts the concept. Yep. Oh. Yep, Peter. Okay. Yeah, I do forget to do that. Please always remind me when I forget to zoom in. So, in case you missed that, cd, we're just going to cd to the directory, and then we're just going to look at, in this case, the SSH file. So this is basically, if we're using sys5 init, the information for how to start and stop this process. So we're not going to get into this super deeply, but gosh. Yeah, this is always fun to dive into these. We see some functions are defined, because bash is awesome or something. There we go. And then these are the directives we can actually use to basically define, to run. These are the ones we actually interact with. And they'll do various things. Normally they do things like, actually start the service, log it start, and then make a PID file somewhere so we can kill it later. So all a PID file is it stores the ID of that process. So later on we can stop that process and kill it off. So for our purposes though, if you have a system that has services that are using this kind of mechanism, or to interact with them, to start them, to stop them, we can just do this. We basically reference the file directly, and we're just going to execute it with whatever. And that's how those are set up. So that just stopped SSH, and now we're going to start SSH. That's all that really works with. We just execute the file directly with either start or stop, and that's all that really happens for those services. We also do, so actually, there's one other thing we'll need to cover quick here. Yeah, same thing goes for restart. We just invoke the file directly with either start, stop, or restart. There's additional directives depending on which service you're using. You might have to dive into those. We'll get into that. What's also important about these is that's where the files live. That's where you can execute them manually and start them manually. But when they're actually executed on boot time, you're going to see some links to some different directories, and these are all going to look like this. So this is the RC 0 through 6 plus the S, and that's basically that defines the order in which they start, and to some degree the order in which they stop as well. Normally, when you're actually working with these, you're going to essentially link your file, which let's just do an ls-la there. Yeah, you're going to see these are all symlinks. So all you do is you take your file and you symlink it into these directories so it gets started on boot at that run level. So RC 0, for example, that's the power off run level. That happens when we shut down. And then RC 2 through, as I said, 4 are normally our normal user-defined ones. That's kind of what we deal with when we're working with networking or a multi-user system. That's kind of the normal core setup there. So if you want to stop a process from starting on boot, you basically define where it's linked in here and then just remove the symlink, and then it will no longer start on boot anymore. So I can find here quick We're not going to dive into making your own, so that's a non-issue. I'm just going to look here quick in 4. Yeah, so for example, if you dive into 4, we're going to see, once again, can't get the mouse cursor, but we're going to see S02 SSH. That's why SSH is starting on boot for us, is because we took that configuration file and we linked it in here. So it's not really a conf file, but we took that startup file and we linked it in here, so that's getting run on boot every time we start up at that specific run level. So that's kind of the basically thing with init.d. You will encounter it rarely directly. Normally you're going to encounter more stuff like this because your services are set up to run with that. But it's not really the actual init system running. There's backwards compatibility measures built into systemd and upstart. So if you write it, it'll still work, but it's not actually the main init system running. They have some mechanisms built in to ensure those run. So yeah, we'll get into that. So that was kind of sys5 init. You're going to have to deal with it less. It's not super modern. It's old. It exists. People, or the service files exist. People use them. You might encounter, as I said, rarely, but not a ton. So upstart. This was, Ubuntu's beautiful brainchild. Mostly we're just going to have to deal with Etsy init. And then they also had a cool idea of Etsy init.d for sys5 init requires root to write to it. So you can't make a service file unless you're root. So they kind of had this cool idea of, let's make it so anybody can make their own service files. So maybe you have a service that you want to start whenever you log in, or you just want to start for your specific, that's basically what it is, whenever you log in as a user account, and you just want to have it always going, but you don't have root on the system for whatever reason. Maybe it's multi-user, so like you remote into it. That's that's basically what that does. It's just a user level system. It makes it even harder for finding persistence though, because if people make malicious services and stick them in here for one of your 50 user accounts, they're going to be a little bit harder to find. Granted, they don't necessarily have root, which is a good thing, but a little bit harder to deal with in that case. So, and then this is normally when we're using services. To the best of my knowledge, normally you can use service for systemd as well. They are set up to be compatible with each other, but this is what service was made for, as far as I'm aware, is for upstart. Systemctl is reserved for systemd, which is what this expression was right here, which is we see service and we see and that might have been referring to upstart. So the question was, what is the difference between that and systemctl and service, which we're kind of diving into now, service right here. Depending on what you're doing, nothing, because service, as far as I'm aware, is set up to execute those files in that manner. So that's basically all service is doing. But depending on the system you're working on, one way is the kind of the preferred method, because that's how it's actually set up, and then the rest of it is just basically cobbled together, because we want our services, we want our stuff to work on regardless of the nuances on that particular system. So when people make packages and they make services and they make servers or services, then they want them to work across the board. So that's kind of the idea there. There's no real difference under the hood necessarily. There might be a couple little nuances, like if you're using systemd and you try to use service, you're not going to be able to enable or disable that service. That's not in your options. You cannot do that with service. So you're going to have to do systemctl or do it some other way, and we'll kind of dive into that as we get into systemd. We'll get to that. Okay, we're actually wrong there. Yeah, so upstart, as I said, kind of the same idea. We're using service now, which, that's what I did name it, beautifully. So this is the FTP upstart box. I'm going to dive into FTP a little bit later here. Creds are the same as before, root and password one bang. And I think I mistyped the password, guys. Thanks, Ubuntu. Actually, okay, we do. Okay. So, something they didn't do right, well, at least in my opinion they didn't do right, is, I don't know about you guys, but this is a really fun directory to mess around with. Actually, how many files do we have in here? Only 85. So if we kind of scroll through here, we're going to see some stuff. Like I see cron right there. That's going to be running as a daemon to run your cron jobs. Networking's in here. We got all sorts of stuff in here. Yeah, TTYs. Okay. Let's look at the cron one. So, some things they did do right. If we look at these, that's a lot less stuff. I think that's kind of one of the appeals for Upstart is, sys5 init is basically a bash script that you just run, you execute. Here we have some, nicer stuff in the middle. Like, I want this cron. I just want it to exec cron, and then I want to run on these run levels and to stop on these run levels, and then some other directives. A little bit nicer, which is not a bad idea. It just didn't catch on. So that's basically the director where they do that. An unfortunate thing is, to the best of my knowledge, everything in here will start on boot time. So there is no symlinking to another directory where they get run automatically. If they are in this directory, they will run, which means by default, any service anybody makes will run on boot level or run at boot if they have that line there that says, run these run levels. So it's not as, you can, honestly, if you just want a service gone and dead, just wipe the file out of this directory and it'll go away. Ideally, you'd move it to somewhere safe. There's also a better way to do it, but sometimes you forget in the middle of competition. Just remember, if there's red team persistence in here and you want to do it somewhat nicely, just get rid of the comp file, this directory, move it somewhere else, and it'll stop running. The nice way to do it is you need to basically echo manual to whatever the name of the service is in the same directory, .override, and that'll override the file and set it to manual. But an example here, so we have, if you notice here, we do have an SSH conf like halfway up the screen somewhere. If we want to interact with that service, instead of trying to execute directly, we're going to use the service command now. Gosh, did I forget my arg? Yeah. That whole file, that's wrong, isn't it? Yeah, it is. Okay. My bad, guys. That is a typo. So, my apologies. Something cool you're also going to notice here in a second when we get a systemd is they flip the args on you for no reason other than they hate you. I'm sure they have some legitimate reason why they never, ever standardize stuff between two similar processes, or two similar systems. But yeah, it's flipped. My bad. Those are all wrong. So what it's going to be is the service, then the name of whatever the process you're trying to do, and then the command. So in this case, I was trying to check the status of the SSH service, and it's going to tell us it's running, and then it has a process ID of 921. If I want to stop it, I just type stop. A lot of the same directives are there. You can make more, and some do have more custom directives, but that's kind of the same idea as we have. Pretty simple. Service, name of the service, stop. And then I'm going to see if we actually had, I don't think that was really what we cared about there. So yeah, if you want to stop it from boot time, you're going to have to do the whole enable thing, or just wipe the conf file out of existence. I'll get to that when we do systemd. So systemd is basically the popular one right now. It's used by most modern systems at this point. If you pull a recent version of, if you pull a new version, let's say, down of Debian or Ubuntu or Fedora, Red Hat, your Debian-based or Ubuntu-based, it is going to be using systemd. This is what, for the moment, the Linux community has basically chosen to use. So it's going to be systemd. That's what you should kind of focus on if you're using it for your own purposes. If you have Linux running your laptop, it's going to have systemd. It also, in my opinion, does have some of the best functionality, although granted I might have just not cared enough to find the same functionality in the other stuff. If you're going to notice here, we have a lot of the same directives, except these are correct because it's systemctl start whatever the service, because as I said, they flipped it between service and systemctl. Some other stuff we didn't see before, we can enable and disable them here from using service. We don't have to delete a file. We don't have to unlink them from rc.d. We can just literally do enable, and it'll run on boot, or disable, and it will no longer run on boot. We also have mask. The difference between those two, so what mask does is it stops it, right? It's kind of like disable, kind of does the same thing. The difference is disable, we'll say you can't run on boot unless some other service says you're a dependency. In that case, it'll run it anyway. So if you disable a service on boot, but some other service has it as a dependency, it will start it, even if it's disabled. If you mask it, it will never get started, even if it is a dependency. It'll just basically, I think it'll cause the other service to not start then, which will throw some errors. It will also use journal D, which I think we'll dive into a little bit. I don't remember, I think we're fairly backwards compatible to our normal logging for systemd, but I think we'll do a command or two for that. So, question, is it better to manual unlink or use service for systemctl? In general, if you have the command, use the command. Don't muck around with configuration files unless you have to. If you have systemctl and you can disable it from systemctl, disable it from systemctl. Don't mess around with stuff you don't have to. Use, in general, as long as the highest level approach works, there's no reason to not use the highest level to do the least amount of work and to let the system do what it's meant to do and manage stuff for you and make your life easier. I don't know if there's any real exceptions there. If systemd, for whatever reason, throws you an error and it says you can't do it because it's something old, then maybe it's time to go muck around. Or if you don't have systemctl and you have upstart, then you're going to have to do it regardless, because unless you have systemd, you don't have access to disable and mask. You don't have access to the high level commands. So briefly, I'm going to pop back over here because this is what we actually have. So if we do systemctl status SSH, and that's actually a lot nicer right there. And that's an example of the journaling system that's built into SSH as a server, or all a systemd now. Is basically, that's journal D logging here. It's a little bit nicer screen than, it's running, we think, and there's a PID. So that's the main difference there. So if we want to stop SSH, kind of the same syntax as we had before. We're just going to say systemctl stop SSH, except it's flipped between systemctl and service. Don't forget that. And if we want to disable the service so it won't start boot anymore, we do that. And it's going to tell us, basically, it's actually doing, in this case, if you notice here, it's saying it's going to execute update rc.d, SSH disable, and then it's going to say some stuff about run levels, which is weird because we're using systemd. We shouldn't really have run levels, right? And that's because SSH in this case was built for sys5init. So what systemd is doing here is basically working with a service that's not built for it. It's being backwards compatible. It's dealing with that. So just saying, for a contest, if you did it manually, would it be more difficult to blue team disable /find out? Once again, depending on what you're doing, it might be. You can do stuff manually. I don't know if it's really going to make it any harder, because if you're using a backwards compatible service, if you notice here, all it's doing is using the same mechanism anyway. So it's just going back and changing the mechanism that is set up for init, sys5init. So for this question here, basically saying if we did it manually, would it be harder for a blue team to deal with? I wouldn't really say it is. It's really no different because the system's managed it for us. It's not going to break if you manually changed it, like they can't enable it now, and they can still do everything they want to, even if you mess with it manually. Doesn't really make a difference to that. Already disabled it, so we're just going to actually enable it because we need SSH back. And then as a note, if you disabled SSH on the SSH box and FTP on the FTP box, we're going to need those in a second. So just make sure you started them again, like I've been doing here. So, okay, now we're just going to briefly kind of go an overview over SSH and FTP as services and what we can do with those. Feel free to continue asking system or init system questions, and we'll go through them as I have time. So we're just going to do a brief overview of SSH on the SSH Server Box. So diving into those quickly. So for SSH, we're gonna cover a couple things. There's some more complicated things they could do to you, but for our main purposes, there's a couple things to understand. One of them is that SSH will use your system user counts 90% of the time. That means if you change passwords for all your user accounts, they are changed in SSH. There is some edge cases where if they join you to the domain, you might have extra user accounts, but it's kind of a different process. You're going to notice those separately because they're normally going to show up as system user accounts. They're not like plugged into SSH most of the time directly. They're just user accounts in general. Things we want to do on SSH is we want to basically make sure the minimal number of user accounts can use it as possible. If root doesn't need SSH and you don't need root to manage it, don't let root use SSH. No pub key, which is kind of questionable in here. So that's the difference between the real world and competitions. We have an option with SSH of using key authentication. We don't use a password. We just have this key that we basically shove at the server, and that's what we use to authenticate. We don't have to remember a password. It does it for us. Once we get that key, we can log in as many times as we want and not have to worry about passwords or remembering anything. The reason we're normally going to tell you to disable that for competitions is that Red Team loves to use public keys for authentication. And because of that, we don't like them to do that. It's really easy for them to stick them and then use the persistence. If we disable them across the board, that's normally easier. And then also the scoring engine will never be using a public key for you. So you could use it for your own management, but you can never score in it anyway. So we normally say just disable it and use a password is normally what we end up doing. It's kind of regrettable because in the real world, you don't want to be using a password if you don't have to. You want to be using a key. But for the contest setting, it makes more sense to disable it because they will be using it and it'll hurt you more than it'll probably help you in most cases unless you're really set up to use it effectively. We don't like bad options. Thankfully, SSH in general doesn't have that many bad options to mess around with. Most of them are pretty hard to exploit, even if they are in there. They're not near as bad as like SMB or FTP, where they have a lot of anonymous access stuff. And then we have, as I said, they have keys. .ssh authorized keys is where they're going to put those public keys so they can authenticate without a password. So even if you change the passwords, they still have the key file in there. You're still in trouble because they can still log in even without the password. And then fail to ban, which I don't think we're going to go over today just because of time. I'll go over that. So, if you didn't see that, I'm editing SSH _config. That's the main config file you're going to see for SSH 90% of the time. You're very rarely going to find a different file for any Linux distribution. So you're already going to know some stuff in here. We have port 22. That's specifying what we're running on. We're going to see some words like protocol. We're going to see some things like host keys. You know, all these different options. You can get into more depth. If you literally search that file path, etsy SSH SSHD _config, you will find all the options and what exactly each one does. We're not going to do that because there's just too many. The checklist has a very good guide to what you can what's actually good and what's actually bad. I'm just going to skip out that quick. Great, now my slides vanished. I just want to pull up on the checklist so you guys can see that quick. Okay, thanks, Google. I just wanted to open it. So you notice here it's pretty short. We might add some additional stuff on here later, but really we're just trying to tell you what the good options are and what the bad options are. So we're going to do that quick here. Nope, I'm the FTP one. So, bad options. Permit root login. Root login will never be used for scoring ever. If your team decides to do something differently, you can. But in general, you want to say no because you're never gonna, or you're not necessarily managing these boxes. Even if you are, there's different ways to do that. In general, Red Team wants to log in as root. It's easier for them. It's somewhere more effective just to say root can never log into the box over SSH ever. Second one, as I was saying, public key authentication we normally disable. So normally we're going to set that to no. It's kind of, as I said, it's regrettable, but normally it does us more harm than good. I don't think I have too many other bad ones. I think I might have one more in here. There's a lot of options in here which don't matter as much. Something else to note is that SSH has a set of default options just built into it. So if you comment most of these, the defaults are normally good for SSH. Be a little more careful. I think they will disable things. They will enable pub key authentication by default, I believe, and they will disable root login by default. So if you comment most of these out without knowing what they do, then it will normally set it to a good option. In general, I think pub key is your only real iffy one. So normally the defaults for a lot of these services are good. They're set to be secure by default. It's when people misconfigure them, that's when bad stuff starts to happen. Like permanent empty passwords, that's something we don't want, as you can tell by the not recommended here when it says to enable passwords change to yes. So Even the config file is trying to help us out here. And there's more options in the file. In general, we're only worried about just key auth for this and root login. Login for the SSH box will be root and password 1 bang capital P.
What's a bang?
Exclamation point. That's a DSU thing apparently. Well, I don't know what it is, but yeah. Password 1 exclamation point capital P. Is there going to be login for that box and almost every other box. If you see a Kali box, it'll be different, but everything else should be about the same. I think I murdered my slides, unfortunately. No, I don't want to share. I want to present. Leave me alone. Okay. Yeah, let me get back to that point. Yeah, VSFTPD, kind of the same idea. In general, FTP for Linux will also use your system level accounts. So if we change passwords across the board, we'll be changing them for FTP as well. This is, as a note, because it's not on here, FTP is very hard to firewall comparatively. I believe there is an IP tables checklist somewhere in the drive that tells you exactly how to firewall it. I would use that, which I actually did forget to do passive FTP in here. So we're going to see that. That's a curious one. Does that actually exist? So somebody asked, what is etsy SSH SSD underscore config versus etsy SSHD underscore or config? Basically, there's an SSH directory in there. I'm curious that both of those exist at the same time. So Nikki's saying there's a second copy of SSHD, and
Yeah, I've never actually seen that.
is there? So in this case, I don't think we have. Yeah, it's auto-completing, so it doesn't exist. It should be the same file. It's possible in some systems they don't put SSH in its own subdirectory. So in that case, if you encounter one where it's just etsy and then the config file, it should be the same process. Yeah, it should be the same process. It's possible some version of SSH just shoves it in there instead. So, but I'm gonna pop into FTP quick and get this done here so we can still go through Windows stuff. Same kind of idea. We want minimal user accounts. FTP is user lists, which are a little bit more complicated. And then we need to, because it's a file share, you need to audit your data directories. You need to audit what files you're actually sharing out. Because even if you're secure, if you're sharing out social security numbers to everyone or even to a select number of people, not the greatest thing. In general, in a competition, people should not have access to social security numbers. You don't give your developers access. Well, I mean, if you have to, I guess you have to. But in general, people who don't need the social security numbers of your clients should not have them. You know, we don't share people's credit card information just to everyone at the company just because they're here. Those should be locked down. So they should not be chilling in your file share by any means. So, I'm going to jump into FTP again. So, when we're using this flavor, and there's also ProFTPD, which I think follows a lot of the same stuff, but it's not one-to-one. It's going to be this file, which it's there at the top. It's etsy vsftpd.conf. The two main ones we're ever going to see is vsftpd and ProFTPD. FTPD. Those are the two main flavors we're ever going to see in these competitions, and they're just because they're just the most popular ones. So you normally see that's what you see. We have the same checklist. I suggest following that. Which actually, Nick, does that have the? Oh, I guess you wouldn't know, would you? Because you know I stole your computer again. It does. So, I would, in general, this is going to have the information you need to follow. This is important, which I'll explain quick. So, FTP, or let's say a service like SSH. We use port 22 for SSH, right? That's our service port. That's what we need to allow through the firewall to access. FTP has some weird things. FTP has basically decided that, or how it's implemented is we need some additional ports to spin up connections for transmitting data back and forth. As I understand it, we have one socket we use for general management, and then when we have data coming through, we spin off basically another connection to a different socket, and that's how we pull data through, as I understand that. So the reason why that's bad is by default, FTP will choose, I think, any ephemeral port range, any port in like 1,000, not more than 1,000. Like, what is it? Does somebody remember the ephemeral range on Linux? It's huge. It's like 20. I don't remember. Basically, it'll choose a port in a stupidly large range, And if you firewall those off for some reason, it will not work if you're using passive FTP for that, which is what the default is. So what that boils down to, you have to set these options. Otherwise, when you firewall it, it will break. That's the core concept. Put those in there or it'll break. And if you do have those in there, then those are the ports you need to have open to also allow for data transfers to go through. And just in general, these options are going to lead you right. We're going to kind of go over a couple. And as I said, if you just Google the name of the file, you will get a man page that will have every single option outlined in detail what it does. Which we're just going to go through here quick here. I don't know why I was doing that. So, local root. That's going to set the data directory for where this is stored. So, I don't remember the default location, but you're normally going to have something like this in the file where it's going to tell you this is what we're serving to users. This is the path to our data. This is what we're giving people. And then you're going to see there's actually two here. There's local root, which is /data. That's for all your user accounts that are local user accounts. And then we have anon root, which is kind of the same idea there. We have a lot of other options here. What we really care about in this case is that we like anonymous enable. That means we can allow anonymous user accounts. Write enable, that means they can write. Our local mask, which if you notice here, it says it should be 077 or 022, is set to 777, which if you guys remember anything from the file permissions talk, that means that our mask for user accounts is they can read everything, they can write everything. Actually, I think this is for files created. I'll have to look at that one. That's either for files created or for what they can do, but it should not be set to 777 because that means every permission possible, which is not good. That's actually an interesting one. I don't think that's how that's set up. We basically have a lot of anon stuff. So in general, if you do not need an anonymous login to your FTP share, everywhere in here where it says anonymous, just turn it to no. Just go into the file and do no. And just do that through the entire thing. If you stop scoring after you make changes to the config file, then you've made a mistake. Go back and fix the config file because the scoring engine is using something that it needs. Which we'll go through that. I think for time reasons, I'm not going to dive super deep into here because we want to get Windows. But in general, if it says anonymous, it's bad. Unless we force you to have anonymous, in which case, don't allow them write, only allow them read. So like, write directory, that's a bad one. Upload, that's a bad one. Unless it's basically read for anonymous users. If we require you to have anonymous, it's not someone I'll have on there for anonymous. And then in here, you'll also write the passive stuff in here. Something I forgot to mention, after you make changes to a file, it's best you either need to reload the service or restart the service. Just in this case, which I don't know which Ubuntu 14. So we're just going to restart. Did I mess it up? FTPD. I think that one's going to fail. Yeah, that's because I flipped it again because they decided to make them backwards because they felt like it. So that's how you have to do restart that. Yeah, so in that case, I had it in the slides wrong. So I might have had it in the slides wrong, SSHD_conf config. It's possible it could be on the Linux system. I would actually believe that, but. And I don't know what they asked nicely was referring to. That's the general laydown on SSH. I went through it really quickly. In general, the two things you need in the drive are that VSFTPD checklist. That'll lead you right as far as what the actual correct options should be for your service. And then there's same thing goes for SSH. And then, as I said, FTP has weird firewall rules. Make sure to look at that checklist, which I will link in DefSec afterwards. The IP tables checklist for that. But one last thing, if we just look at the data directory, it's all you have to do is start to evaluate what's in here. Like if you notice here, we have social_security.txt, which it's blank, but it probably shouldn't exist in our file share regardless. So that's the kind of things to look out for. If you have more questions, please Slack me. But for the moment, I think we need to turn over to Windows so Windows can do things too. So that's the end of this one. I didn't probably yell at me. So we'll say yes. Otherwise, I guess I'll just yell questions that absolutely happen.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Active Directory and a little bit of group policy today. And the VApp is DefSec Active Directory, so make sure that that's booted up and ready to go. So Active Directory is essentially a centralized location to manage permissions and access to network resources. So like in the Active Directory, there's like user accounts and computer accounts, and using those you can somewhat manage who can access what, and it allows for easy management of user accounts and user permissions. So Active Directory domains are identified by a DNS name. So like today we will be using defsec.local as our domain. And then the computers will be identified by a subdomain. So in this case, dc1.defsec.local. So the domain controller is the most critical system in the domain. The DC is the system that handles pretty much all the authentication requests to Active Directory. There are usually multiple DCs in an environment, and the DC, at least in most CCDC environments, also hosts the DNS server. So if you lose your DC, everything Windows will probably go down. So, and then there's group policy, which is a pretty long list of things you can apply to different sections of AD, such as password policies, logon banners, account lockout policies. You can even set Windows firewall, and it's a fairly common thing to see in competitions to have the Windows firewall shut off from group policy. So it's a good idea to figure out where that's at and turn it back on. Okay, and we'll jump over to the VApp in a minute. So there's a question, should Red Team prioritize the DC? Probably. Like they usually do. If they get access to that, they usually can destroy everything. Okay, so let's hop over to the Windows Server 2016 VM. And log in with password 1bang. And wait for it to log in and full server manager to come up. So so once this gets ready to go, you click manage, add roles and features, and then you'll hit next a few times until you get the server roles. So in order to make a domain, you have to install Active Directory domain services and the DNS server. And then you just click next to the rest of this and hit installed. Okay, so we're waiting for this. There's a question, how does the blue team defend the DC? That is pretty much through firewall rules, auditing the domain admins group, just make sure that access to the DC is monitored. It's another question, will I have to set up my own DC in competitions? It depends on the competition. Sometimes we've had competitions where nothing's joined to the domain at the beginning. Sometimes, I think it's happened with Ice Age, sometimes it's optional to make EC, so you can set it up and run all your authentication through that. So it has happened in the past where you do have to set up a DC during the competition. And then there's one more question. So, this is going back to the slides with the domain name. So yeah, it's like, it'd be like dsu.local on campus, defsec.local. Then wouldn't you want a DC? Well, you'd want a DC to easily control all the authentication. You can even hook up Linux boxes to it if you want to. Well, a reason that you wouldn't want it though is because everything becomes dependent on the DC then. And this is taking slightly longer than I thought. Okay, so to create a domain, so after the install is complete, you'll see a little notification up in this flag in the corner, and then it says post-deployment configuration, Active Directory domain services needs to be configured. So click promote this Solval 2 domain controller. And since this is a brand new domain, you want to click add a new first. And then type in your domain name. And click next. And then type in a password for the directory, service restore mode. So then click next. Next. It's going to automatically populate the NetBIOS domain name in a second. And click next. Click next. And then it'll check for if this server meets all of the prerequisites to be a domain controller. And then it'll complain about a few things. Those are just notifications. And then click install. So while this is creating the domain, what services and ports does a DC provide? It's kind of, there's really no specific ports for, well, they're all specific ports for Active Directory, but it's the best idea just to use the built-in firewall rules for Active Directory, because it's really tough to make individual rules for each port if you want to go that route. And with services, Active Directory runs on LDAP and I think a little bit of SMB. And then another question, is there a Linux equivalent of a Windows DC? Is there a Linux equivalent?
There is Samba, which basically emulates the same protocol, but is the Linux version, and it is probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
It exists.
And there are other mechanisms for Linux centralized authentication, like LDAP servers, which you can use that do sort of do like a stripped down version of a DC, which just does authentication. Directory services.
How hard would it be to apply egress firewall rules to a domain controller?
Well, once again, the best idea is just to use the Active Directory firewall rules that are built into Windows Firewall. That's probably the best answer.
Egress-wise, right, you have to probably think about what's going to be
Yeah.
stuff, right? That's not being started from something coming in.
Yeah.
I forget what Windows services natively do that with sites. If you're gonna browse the internet yourself on DC, which you shouldn't.
I
Yeah.
think DNS and FTP.
DNS probably could have chopped off
my head. What do you might need?
LDAP went in there, yeah.
No, it wasn't. Okay, another question. Can you attach Linux boxes to a Windows domain? For authentication, yes. I don't think you can do anything else to them, though. Can you? Is it just authentication?
You get the users and you get the groups and you
Okay.
get the credentials as well.
Yeah.
And I mean you could kind of. It's really janky, but yeah, you can kind of add some additional stuff too. But it's mostly just users and groups and some credentials.
Mm-hmm.
I think a big thing to understand, right, is DC handles all authentication, essentially, for your Windows environment. If it's joined to it, that it's another step in your checklist almost, right? Besides you going through your local accounts, the next thing you need to do is make sure you or the Windows admin is going through the AD accounts, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm pretty sure is going to go through here. But
Mm-hmm.
keep that in mind. That should be your next step. Either you or where you're at in this.
But I mean, the main advantage is that yeah, you can centralized authentication across all your boxes.
Yeah.
It's easier to change one set of passwords than it is to change.
Yeah, then to log into every box and switch passwords. But for local accounts in Windows, you still need to log into every box and change. But domain accounts, you don't. And for who asked that question, yes, it would be a bad idea to run a Minecraft server on a DC.
I don't know, guys. I don't know if we've ever had an exploitable Minecraft server before. I mean, wasted effort, surely. But
Put a flag.
I
Find another way to get into creative mode and then fly.
I feel like the most effective way would just be to find a good way to crash the server as fast as possible. Or crash the box. Toss the box to the miners.
With updates, you can say you can
Okay, so someone asked, don't you still need to log into each box to set up the DC? To join boxes to the domain, you still need to log into the box and join it to the domain.
It's important to note that you're probably going to change the passwords on your systems more than once throughout the competition.
Mm-hmm.
If you only need to change them once, you're having a really good day for some reason.
And this hopefully finishes in the next 20 seconds.
Yes, this is why we don't use GUIs, guys. This is the number one reason. That spinning wheel, 90% of the processor usage. No, that's just Windows being funny.
Okay, someone asked, if you set good passwords, wouldn't you not need to change them? It's still a good idea to change them multiple times during the competition.
You're going to need to change them after. So, you set good passwords. Good job. But red team got it in minute 0. They got it in 15 seconds in. And they keylogged your good passwords. So now they also have your good passwords. So just because they're good passwords doesn't mean red team doesn't have your passwords now. So at that point, what you'd want to do is kick them out, remove the persistence, shut off whatever their keylogger is, and then you change passwords again. And if you're having a really bad day where they continue to get access to you, then every time you remove their new persistence and kick them out, you're gonna have to change passwords again. Otherwise, they still have them. Even if they're, you know, the super awesome 64 character password, red team is just copy pasting them in if they even have to do that.
So if I can add to that, the goodness of good passwords is mostly so they can't guess it by just trying over and over and over and brute forcing. If they're already in, they don't have to guess it. So that good password is no better than a bad password since they already have it.
Probably haven't talked about it a lot, but real world, you're gonna want real world competition setting might be a little bit different there. For the competition setting, you basically need a password that is complex enough that they cannot hit it with a word list, and they cannot brute force it very easily, or they can't rather crack your hash really fast. So you know there's a minimum length requirement there. But at that point, just make it easier to type at that point. So you know, don't type in a 64 character password if you have to type it in.
Okay, now that Soulful finally came back up, so you'll notice a few things are different. So first of all, that's asking you to log in as the domain admin. So type in the password that you used to log in before password one bang. And once a box, like a Soulful's a DC, it no longer has any local accounts on it. So the only accounts on this box, on all the domain accounts. So now I'll go over how to add stuff to a domain. So hop over to the Windows Server 2019 box. Sign into it like you did the last one. And the full step to adding to the domain is actually to go into the network settings and go to change adapter options, right click Ethernet 0, click properties, go to IPv4, and then type in for the full DNS server, do 192.168.0.2. That is the IP address of the DC we just set up. And it is also running a DNS server, which is linked to Active Directory. So then we want to go to local server, hit where it says work group here, then click change, click domain, and then type in defsec.local. Then it's gonna prompt for authentication. Type in the domain admin username and password. It's gonna say welcome to the domain, and you must restart the PC. It's gonna reboot this. So someone asked what would happen if DNS went down. Quite a few other things will go down also. Yes. So if the scoring engine is like using DNS names to check services, you will no longer be scoring on anything that's dependent on DNS. Someone asked, do I have to type in the domain admin account to join to the domain, or can I have a different user? You can use any user that you gave permission to join the domain, to join computers to the domain. So Since we did not promote this to a DC, this still maintains its local administrator account. So if you go into computer management, and then go into local users and groups, you can see that it still has all the default local users, and you can even add more local users if you wanted to. And then under groups, under the local administrators, domain admins are added by default on a computer that's joined to the domain, along with the local admin account. So if you're ever in a situation where you need to add a second DC to the domain, you would essentially just install the Active Directory domain services in DNS, click promote this server to a domain controller. Then instead of clicking add a new forest, just put add a new domain controller to an existing forest. And then change this to the domain admin and just essentially just hit next through the rest of it. Okay, someone asked, can you do DC stuff in PowerShell? Yes, you can. I'm guessing we're going to go over PowerShell in the future sometime.
We will. I don't know if we're going to do, like, probably not going to teach you all the stuff you need to do in a DC, but
Yeah.
basic PowerShell stuff, and hopefully
Like if you go Windows Server Core or something like that.
because you should use all the same server core stuff on a normal DC, right?
Technically, to set up Server Core, you just link into Server Manager and use the GUI. Okay, so type the restore password in. And I think this even gives you this verifies that's okay. Yeah, so you just click install and it promotes that computer to a domain controller. And it will reboot once it's done. So let's hop on over to the Windows 10 box, sign into it. So to add a workstation to the domain, it's a little bit of a different process. The best way that I think to get there is to click File Explorer, right click on this PC, go down to Properties, and then in this area, click Change Settings, and then it's the Change the Domain or Work Group. Just realize that the DNS settings probably, 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 just realize that the need to be switched on this one too. So put in 192.168.0.2 on this also. And type in defsec.local. Type in the domain admin password, and this will be added to the domain now. So now we're going to touch a little bit on group policy. So to edit group policy, I believe it's in Tools and Group Policy Management. And do this on the Windows Server 2016 box. So once that opens, there's go domains, defsec.local, and then there's this default domain policy. If you set something in this policy, it will apply to the whole domain, and that is the only group policy object by default. So if you right click this and edit, so in here you can dig through group policy to like set, let's see if I can remember what this is. Security settings. So account policy, password policy. So here's all your password policies. So it says, so like you can enforce the password history, minimum password length, password must meet complexity requirements, stuff like that. And here's account lockout settings. So you can lock accounts after so many invalid lockout attempts. And I believe it's in here somewhere. And if you go down to local policies and security options, you can set the login panel. So like message text for users attempting to log in. So if you set that, and then the one right underneath it is the title for it. So click to find this policy, type it in. So if we go over to a Windows 10 box,
Give you a request to please zoom in.
yep. Come on. If I can.
Should be control plus.
There we go. Oh. That's about as far as I can go. So if we want those group policies to automatically apply, immediately apply, go into command prompt on like the Windows 10 box. And once it opens, type gp update / force. And then it will go out and update the group policy. And once that's done, which will be a second, you will see that logon panel should be defined. Okay. What does GP update / force do? It essentially, when you change group policy, it usually takes a certain amount of minutes to reach out to the domain and check for updates and then pull them down. What GP update / force does is it does it immediately. And someone asked, why does it matter what I set the logon panel to? The only reason why you would ever really look at that group policy is if it's an inject, which in most competitions they end up making it an inject. Someone put, can I put ASCII alt in the panel if you want to? Ooh, I forgot to go through this. How do I see a user's group? How do I remove a user from AD? That's a good question. So you go over to Tools, click Active Directory Users and Computers. I go down to the domain, and then your users and groups are all shoved into this same folder. So, like there's the administrator account, there's guest. So if you want to add a new user, you just right click in here, click new, user, type in a name. And just type in a login name, hit next, set a password for that new user. And then you can set the different options down here, like if you want the account to be instantly disabled, want to set the password to never expire, and stuff like that. And it will create that user. And if you want to like make this user a domain admin, just go to this group, double click on it. It will list in the members tab, it will list who is in that group. So if you click add and just type in the username, click check names, it'll automatically find it, and then just hit OK. Now that user's a domain admin. And there's kind of a few groups that you want to keep an eye on in here in case your red team adds members to them, such as, well, domain admins, DNS admins, let's see what else, enterprise admins especially. So someone asks, what is an inject? It's essentially an aspect of a CCD competition that requires you to do some sort of task, either make some sort of report or do something on your systems that will be checked later. Trying to think, oh yeah, just take a look at Windows Firewall real quick. So, as far as inbound rules and outbound rules are concerned with Windows Firewall, you will always want these Active Directory domain controller rules on. And let's see, where is it at? Yeah, those are the key rules for domain controller, and then from there you can trim down some of the other rules in this. Same with the outbound rules. Be sure to keep the Active Directory domain controller rules, and then you can decide what to trim out from there. And then the last thing I'm gonna look at is if you're in a situation where you need to demote a DC during a competition. which I have had to do once. So if you log into the DC, and once it comes up, so to demote this solver from DC, you go to Manage, Remove Roles and Features, and once solver manager is done collecting data, you can bring it up. So then you just hit next over to solver roles, if it ever gets there. And you uncheck Active Directory domain services, click Remove Features, and then it does a check to see if that service is being used, which it is, and it's gonna warn you about it. You just click Demote this domain controller. And once this is ready to go, just click Next, click Proceed with Removal. Since this is the secondary DC, you need to set up a password for the local admin account that will be placed on this system, since it will no longer be a DC. Click Next, and then Demote. And then that'll take a few minutes, reboot the server, and then it'll be no longer a DC. So any other questions? Well, that's everything.
In that case, guys, I think we'll close up for the night then.